We're going to talk about a world where your birth pretty much decided your entire future. A system so rigid that, well, it eventually just shattered.
We're talking about France before 1789, the period known as the Old Regime.
And the most important thing to get your head around is hierarchy. That was everything.
Exactly. Society was split into three distinct groups called the estates, and moving between them was, for all intents and purposes, impossible. You were born into your place.
Right. And at the very top of that pyramid, you have the king. He ruled with what's called absolute power.
Meaning he could make laws, declare war, raise taxes, all on his own say-so. But what really cemented that power was this idea of divine right.
What did that actually mean in practice?
Well, it meant the king and the people believed his power came directly from God. So if you questioned the king, you weren't just making a political statement.
You're a challenging guy.
You were committing sacrilege. It made any kind of organized dissent incredibly dangerous.
So today, let's unpack what life was actually like inside each of those three estates and see how the whole thing was pushed to a breaking point.
Let's start with the top, the structure of privilege. The first and second estates, the groups who held all the cards.
The first estate, this was the clergy, everyone who worked for the Catholic Church. And they were a tiny group, right? Less than 1% of the population.
Tiny but powerful for two main reasons. First, the church owned a huge amount of land, something like 10% of all of France.
Wow.
And second, they had enormous influence over daily life, morals, beliefs. They were almost a state within the state.
And this is where the cracks start to show on the financial side. The clergy collected their own taxes from the people.
Right, the tithe, which was supposed to be a tenth of your income or crops. But when it came to them paying taxes to the king,
They were exempt.
almost entirely. They might give a voluntary gift to the crown, but it was, a fraction of what they would have owed.
But it wasn't all equal within the first estates itself, was it?
No, not at all. You had this massive gap. The high-up officials, the bishops and archbishops, often from noble families, were incredibly wealthy. But the local parish priest often lived in poverty, right alongside the peasants he served. He saw their struggles firsthand.
That's a really important distinction. Okay, so moving on to the second estate, the nobility.
A slightly larger group, maybe 2% of the population. These were your military leaders, your top government officials, your judges.
And their power was inherited.
Exactly. They inherited titles, wealth, and about 25% of the land. Plus, they had these old feudal rights, which meant they could collect dues and even free labor from the peasants on their land.
And like the clergy, the big perk was
No taxes, or at least exemption from the heaviest ones. They made the rules, but they didn't really have to pay to support the state.
we have this image of them all living at the Palace of Versailles.
And many of the most powerful ones did. But that was actually a form of control by the king. He wanted them there, caught up in complex social rituals.
Keeping them busy.
And keeping them away from their home provinces where they might stir up trouble. It was a very clever, very expensive way to keep them in line.
So you have a combined 3% of the population, clergy and nobility, controlling most of the land and wealth, but not funding the government.
Which brings us to the core problem of the old regime, the third estate.
The other 98%.
Yes, the vast majority of the French people.
And this huge group was the one holding everything up. They were the only ones legally required to pay regular taxes to the king.
Plus the tithe to the church and the dues to the local lord. They supported the entire country with their money and their labor, but had basically zero political voice.
But calling it the third estate makes it sound like one unified group, and it wasn't, was it?
No, it was incredibly diverse. The only thing they had in common was that they weren't born with legal privileges. Inside that 98%, you had a whole other hierarchy of wealth.
Okay, so let's unpack that. At the very top of this group, you had the bourgeoisie.
The rising middle class. Bankers, factory owners, merchants, doctors, lawyers, they were often highly educated and in some cases, wealthier than the nobles.
And they're maybe the most critical group here because they were reading all these new ideas.
Exactly. They were deep into the philosophy of the Enlightenment ideas about liberty, equality, and that your success should be based on merit, not your family name.
And that created a huge conflict. They're funding the state, they're driving the economy, but a noble could look down on them just because of who their grandfather was.
And they deeply, deeply resented that. They wanted their social status to match their economic power, and the system wouldn't allow it. They became the monarchy's most well-spoken critics.
Okay, so below the bourgeoisie.
You have the city workers, tradespeople, laborers, servants. They lived in crowded conditions on very low wages.
And for this group, One thing mattered more than anything else.
Bread. The price of bread. They spent such a huge portion of their income on food, so if the price of bread went up,
It meant starvation. It's that immediate.
terrifyingly immediate. Which is why they were so often at the center of protests and riots. They were desperate.
And finally, the base of the entire system.
The peasants. About 80% of France's population. They spent their lives in the fields, working land they'd likely never own.
And they carried the heaviest load of all.
By far. They were hit by every tax, the king's tax, the church's tithe, the nobles' dues. They lived in small huts, and a single bad harvest could ruin them.
Let's talk a bit more about those taxes.
Mm-hmm.
The unfairness is, well, it's hard to grasp. You mentioned the tail.
The tail, yes. This was the main direct tax on land and property, and the first and second estates were completely exempt.
So the primary tax funding the government was paid only by the common people.
Exactly. And then you had taxes on everything else. The most hated was probably the gabelle, the salt tax.
Why salt?
Because you needed it to survive, to preserve food. And the government didn't just tax it. They forced every person to buy a certain amount each year at a ridiculously high price. Smuggling salt was a crime punishable by death.
That's incredible. So with all these taxes combined, how much of a family's income are we talking about?
In some regions, it could be over half their annual income, sometimes as much as 60 or 70% just gone. To the king, the church, and the Lord, it made getting ahead completely impossible.
It seems so self-destructive. Didn't the king's ministers see that exempting the wealthiest people from taxes would eventually bankrupt the country?
Oh, they saw it. They absolutely did. Starting in the 1770s, finance ministers tried over and over again to reform the system.
But the nobility just refused.
They had the power to refuse. They controlled the high courts, the parliaments, and they blocked every single attempt at tax reform. They had basically written their privilege into the law.
And at the same time, the government was already in massive debt.
Huge debt, mostly from fighting expensive wars, especially from helping the American colonists win their revolution against Britain. France helped create the United States, but it bankrupted itself in the process.
So the financial system is collapsing, and then things get even worse.
Right. On top of the financial crisis, you get an economic disaster, a series of terrible harvests in the 1780s.
Which means a grain shortage.
And that means the price of bread just explodes. This created widespread hunger, desperation. It proved in a very real, very visceral way that the old regime couldn't even provide the most basic needs for its people.
So you have debt, you have failed reforms, and you have people who are literally starving.
It's the most explosive mix you can imagine. People weren't just angry anymore, they were rioting for food.
And while all this is happening, people's minds are filling with radical new ideas.
The Enlightenment, a movement that said we should use reason and logic to improve our world, not just rely on tradition.
And this is the intellectual breaking point.
It really is. Thinkers like Rousseau and Locke started asking fundamental questions. Why should power be based on birth? They came up with this idea of a social contract.
That government gets its power from the people, not from God.
Exactly. That sovereignty, the ultimate authority, rests with the nation itself, not with the king.
And these weren't just academic ideas.
No, they were being discussed everywhere, by the educated middle class, the bourgeoisie, in coffee houses and salons. The monarchy tried to censor them, but it was too late. The ideas provided the perfect justification for a revolution.
So by the late 1780s, all these pressures, the debt, the hunger, the new ideas, they all converge.
And the government is broke, completely insolvent. The king, Louis XVI, has to admit he's out of options.
So he makes a final, desperate move.
He calls a meeting of the Estates General, representatives from all three estates, to try and solve the financial crisis. This was a huge deal. They hadn't met in 175 years.
But the very structure of the meeting was the problem, right?
Yes. Traditionally, each estate got one vote, which meant the first and second estates could always team up and outvote the third estate 2-1.
They could block any reform that threatened their privileges.
But the third estate, now full of these new ideas, demanded a change. They said, we represent 98% of the people. We should vote by head.
And the privileged classes refused.
They did. And that's when the third estate took a step that changed history. They walked out.
What did they do?
They gathered separately on a tennis court of all places and declared themselves the National Assembly. They were basically saying, we are the true voice of the nation.
And that was the beginning of the end for the old regime.
The point of no return. So what does this all mean? Well, this rigid system built on birthright and unfair taxes, it just couldn't survive. It was too brittle to handle a major economic crisis and too backwards to survive the power of new ideas about freedom and rights.
The privileged few refused to bend, and so the entire system broke.
In the end, their refusal to make a small sacrifice cost them everything.
See you next time.